Hello, everyone. Welcome back to session 2 in our study in Jonah. Last week, we got an introduction to the book, looking at the historical, cultural background of Jonah, learning who this man Jonah was, and then digging into the first 3 verses in the book of Jonah, which gave us an introduction to the call of God, the purpose for the call, and Jonah's response to the call, which was obviously disobedience. Here in today's study, we're going to see what were the results of that disobedience. Jonah's set out to go to Tarshish. Is that going to be successful? How is God going to handle this rebellion in Jonah's life? And how is Jonah's sin going to impact him and others going forward? If you would open your Bibles to Jonah chapter 1, I will have it up on the screen, but I will also have some other slides. So if you have your Bible open, you'll be able to see sometimes what I'm talking about, even if it's not up on the screen. So I would encourage you to get your Bibles and open up to Jonah chapter 1. We're going to finish pretty much the rest of the chapter today, but let's start with a little bit of review from last week. Verses 1 through 3. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. So last week we saw that it was time for God to deal with the wickedness of Nineveh. We looked at how egotistical and cruel they were as a people. And we saw how God chose Jonah as an instrument for his purposes in Nineveh. But Jonah didn't want to be used as an instrument. He was an unwilling instrument, and he chose to disobey God. Last week we looked at many of the reasons that Jonah may have likely done that, and we saw that he was seeking to go out of the presence of the Lord. Remember that cultures had a very territorial understanding of gods, of deities, thinking that this God is God in this country, but this God is God in that country. They're ruling there. They're ruling there. And we see that Jonah was lying to himself and potentially had so assimilated his thinking to conform to the cultures around him that he believed the lie that you could escape the presence of God. Obviously, that's not possible, but Jonah is trying to do it anyway. Here's about where Gath Hefer is, Jonah's hometown. It would be 650 miles up here to Nineveh, quite a journey. But he goes down to Joppa, which is fairly close to Gath Hefer, still here on the coast, and he gets on a ship bound for Tarshish, which is all the way over here, at the edge of the known world, which is what this map represents. So Jonah is trying to go exactly the opposite direction of where God called him to. The ship he got on likely looked something like this, and he would have most likely been sailing with Phoenicians. The mariners that we're going to read about in the study today were likely Phoenician, and these people were very, very skilled sea travelers who were quite familiar with the Mediterranean Sea. A little bit of looking back on verse 3. As I mentioned, Jonah's lying to himself in order to continue seeking his own will and pretending that that's the best thing for him to be doing. He's got to continue to lie to himself. It's very important that we tell ourselves the truth. he's left his world behind. He left his nation, his culture, his family, his profession. As a prophet of God, it's kind of important that you're in right relationship with God. So as he says, no, I'm going to disobey, I'm not going to do that prophetic work, he's kind of leaving that prophetic profession behind. So we're going to see today some of the other results that come about from his disobedience. But we can already see this is radically reshaping his life and costing him quite a bit. We want to note circumstances did not prevent him from disobedience. God didn't close the doors. And in fact, Satan has a way of opening worldly doors to help us run away from God. That's what he wants us to do, run away from God. So he's going to do everything he can as the ruler of this world, as he's called, to allow us, to help us, to motivate us to disobey God. We might well go on in disobedience and in rebellion and appear to be getting away with it. But sooner or later, God is going to step in. And in this story, we're going to see that it's going to be sooner for Jonah. Jonah didn't let God work through his word because Jonah disobeyed the word. So God's going to step in and change Jonah's plans. He's going to work in the circumstances because Jonah didn't let him work through the word. With that, let's hop into the text for today, starting with verses 4 through 6. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." I want to note that the Lord hurled this great wind. This storm is of the Lord, the beginning of his seeking to get Jonah's attention. And then it's called a mighty tempest, so that the ship threatened to break up. The language here is suggestive of like the ship having a mind of its own and thinking about breaking. So what this is meaning is the ship was in imminent danger of breaking, of being destroyed, and all of these men dying. They clearly thought they were going to die. And remember, these were likely Phoenicians, very skilled, very experienced sea travelers with the Mediterranean Sea. They'd seen storms before, and yet this one they thought was going to kill them. It was a very traumatic storm, but God intended this to be a transforming storm, both in the lives of the mariners and in Jonah's life, as we're going to see. There's no escaping for Jonah now. How did the mariners respond to this storm? First, they had an emotional response. They were very, very afraid. They thought they were going to die. They had a religious response. Though they were worshiping idols, they did instinctually cry out to all of their gods. And they responded in desperation. They threw the cargo overboard. That was kind of their livelihood. It's clearly a last-ditch effort to throw the cargo overboard. You don't do that unless you have to survive. And they thought they had to survive. So they're responding in desperation. And lastly, they turned to Jonah. And this is exactly the direction that God intended to point the focus. But we note that Jonah was below deck. He was sleeping. Jonah had lost his spiritual energy, his focus. He clearly, he didn't seem to have any regard for others. Perhaps he didn't think his disobedience, his fleeing to Tarshish would impact anybody else but him. But he doesn't really seem to care how his sin is impacting others. He's got this real spirit of apathy, and he's lost this real peace that comes from abiding relationship with God. And he's settling for this false sense of security, this I'm going to go sleep and kind of escape in that manner. I also want to pose the question, how could Jonah have been sleeping during a storm like this? Such an intense storm that these Phoenicians thought they were going to die. It was no doubt very rocky, very loud. How is he asleep? It's possible, maybe, that he went to bed before the storm came, and the storm came very quickly. It was a divine storm, so that there he is sleeping, and all of this happens very quickly. But it's also possible, and this is speculation, but it's possible that he was under the influence of alcohol or something else that was helping him to sleep even in the midst of that storm. But the captain comes to him and says, "What do you mean, you sleeper? How are you sleeping in a time like this?" They were obviously very emotionally distraught. But Jonah's asleep. He's got this false sense of security. He's lost his real peace. And sadly, he has to be told to pray by a pagan. Their response was earlier to cry out to their gods. And Jonah yet had not done that. He's been asleep. He's been in the depths of the ship. So the captain comes and tells Jonah that he should be praying to his God. The mariners clearly believed that there was a God responsible for this storm, and that God could spare them, because at the moment it seems like none of them will be spared. And that brings us to a point culturally. Back then, these pagan societies had a very, very meritorious cause and effect understanding of their relationship with gods, with deities. They had gods related to food and crops, related to travel, sea travel. Every area of life kind of had its own god. And if they did well, if they sought to do things that they believed pleased the gods, they thought they would be blessed. But if they did things that angered or upset the gods, they would be cursed in some way. So they really lived their lives in fear, seeking to do everything that they could to appease the gods. And they were coming up with their definition of what it meant to appease the gods on their own. They didn't know what would truly appease them. And then when they were blessed, they were happy. But it was a superficial happiness, because they knew it was only a matter of time before they could potentially anger or upset a god and be cursed. And when things happened that in human terms didn't go their way, they instantly went back to, we've angered, we've upset one of the gods, and they responded like this. They were emotional, they were religious, they went back to the drawing board, like, okay, what did we do wrong? How are we going to appease these gods? It was a very fear-driven, meritorious religious system. But here today in these verses, they're going to meet a God of grace who doesn't operate that way. Yes, the storm is divine. God brings this storm about to get Jonah's attention. But this is for Jonah's best interest. This is a God of grace who wants also the best interest of the mariners. And we're going to see that as we continue to go through. Just keep that in mind. So we have the storm, the way the mariners responded, and he's been in the bottom of the ship sleeping. Captain told him to pray. verses 7 through 10. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told him. So as we look at these verses, we really see the pagan perspective on their relationship with deity. You really see them trying to appease the gods. They think we're in this situation because somebody's done something wrong and we're being cursed because a god is angry at them. As it turns out, that's actually kind of close to what's actually happening, but it's different than they think it is. And we're going to see that. But they're casting lots. They're trying to figure out who's done the thing to upset the gods. And when the lot falls on Jonah, they try to figure out what he did to upset the gods. And they're ultimately going to try to figure out how they can appease this God. We know that God ordained the result of the casting of lots. Proverbs 16:33, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." And I want to note that this wasn't just a pagan practice. Israel also engaged in casting lots and similar things like this in order to determine what to do in some cases. Some of their decision making, the Urim and Thummim, for instance, Israel did that as well. God ordained that the lot was fall on Jonah. All the attention was on him. He wasn't going to be able to hide his sin. It came out that Jonah was the cause of the storm. Far from being a blessing to others, as God intended for him to be as an instrument of his, as an Israelite, Jonah had become a curse to those around him, endangering their lives. Yes, the lives of Jonah, the lives of the mariners, but also who else was on the Mediterranean Sea that day who was in danger of death because of Jonah? Our sin can impact people that we don't even know, that we never realize the impact that it has. Now, we do want to note that our sin can cause storms. We can be the cause of storms, literal storms such as this, or other more metaphorical storms in our and other people's lives. But God doesn't run the world the same way these mariners thought. It's not that every time there's a storm, it's somebody's fault. We got to figure out whose fault it is, and they're going to be the one to fix the problem. Sometimes we go through storms for a variety of other reasons that may not have anything to do with us. Just look at the mariners, for instance. They were going through a storm that had nothing to do with them, right? And yes, this was ordained by God, and he ultimately is above, sovereign over creation in all circumstances. But sometimes he allows things in a natural order. They'd gone through many storms before that likely weren't so directly ordained by God. Those are just natural storms. There's no need to look at a storm in life and say, all right, who did it? Or worse yet, all right, I did it. What did I do wrong? You know, to be blaming is not the way to respond to storms. And we see that these mariners in verse 8, they want to know his occupation. They want to know where he's from. They want to know his nationality and ethnicity. They're really trying to dig in and get the details on who this guy is so that they can figure out who's his God, what did he do. These details were of value in figuring that out, where he's from, what people group he's with. Oh, this is the kind of God that we're dealing with here. And they had not been exposed to the true God of Israel yet. And in verse 9, we see the climax of this section. Jonah's going to give his defense. I like to call this section Jonah on trial, because the mariners know that it's him. They're trying to figure out why this is happening. In verse 9, Jonah gives his defense. He shares his testimony. Let's look at that again. And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Jonah's message here, he shares his nationality. He's Hebrew. He shares his God. I messed this up when I put this in the PowerPoint, but this is all caps, the Lord, which means that it's talking about Yahweh, the covenantal name of God, indicative of his faithfulness, which is kind of ironic given Jonah's situation right now. He shares of God's sovereignty, the God of heaven, and how he is the creator God who made sea and dry land. This is a very hypocritical defense. Jonah had not been true to his identity. He had not been obedient to his God. He's a Hebrew seeking to go to Tarshish to avoid God. He says, I fear the Lord. Really? You're running from the Lord. He mentions that in verse 10, that he told them that he'd been running from the Lord. But also in these verses, he gets the point across that the mariners wanted to know. They wanted to know, why is this storm happening? And they learn from this verse that the God of heaven, the one true God, made the sea and the dry land. He's the one who's over this situation. And Jonah, one of this true God's servants, had been running away from him. These mariners feared God more than Jonah did. They took these events very seriously. If we look at verse 10 again, the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Now, putting ourselves back in the situation of these mariners, they thought that they were in this situation because Jonah had done something wrong, and they were being cursed because of it. They were extremely fearful of the wrath of the gods, and they lived their lives in fear, as I mentioned. So it's no surprise when they learn that the God who's responsible for this, the God who made the sea and the dry land, the true God, I serve him, but I'm running from him. They see there's a God responsible, and here's the guy who angered him, and this storm that threatens to destroy us is a result of that. And they are extremely fearful. So what do you want to do? Well, they're going to try to appease the God and get away from the storm, if possible. So the verdict, they give Jonah a chance to declare the verdict for himself, because he knows this God better than they do. Then they said to him, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. So the mariners are seeking, their ultimate priority is, how do we get the storm to stop? How do we get the storm to stop? And that often is our priority in storms. Jonah doesn't care. He's very apathetic. He wasn't trying to hide anything. He had told them that he was running from God. He pled guilty. He said, the storm is because of me. I accept that. I recognize that. He got to choose his sentence. He says, throw me into the sea. With a storm like that, it's very, very clear Jonah's probably going to die from this. He essentially is choosing a death sentence when he says, throw me into the sea. And everybody knew that. The mariners and Jonah knew that. As Jonah would again later in the book that we're going to see later on, he wanted to die. He wanted to die before he would obey God and observe the grace of God that he had toward Nineveh. Jonah wanted nothing to do with that. God hasn't quite seen the change in Jonah that he's looking for yet. Implementing the verdict, verses 13 through 15. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. The mariners clearly believed Jonah would die in the sea, and they didn't want to be responsible. If this guy's being cursed for disobeying his God, we don't want to anger this God and be cursed as well. Also, they cared more about Jonah than he had cared about them. Jonah was in the bottom of the ship, sleeping when this storm is threatening to break their ship. These guys are trying to row back to shore, which indicates that they hadn't gotten very far out of the port of Joppa before this storm came. But they were trying to row back. They wanted to save Jonah's life if they could. They recognized the sovereignty of God. They said, you basically have done as it pleased you. They knew that God was sovereign. They're learning some things about this God, and they were begging for mercy. But then they did throw Jonah in the sea, and the sea became calm. So they ultimately did what Jonah told them to do, and sure enough, the sea became calm. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. This is the aftermath of the storm, both in the lives of the mariners and in Jonah's life himself. Despite Jonah's hypocrisy, despite him saying, I fear the Lord, and yet he's running from the Lord, these men come from a place of initially being afraid of God to then fearing God. And these sacrifices were often very elaborate and involved, involving like an altar and sacrificing something to God. They'd thrown all their cargo overboard, didn't have that. It's not likely that they're going to start the ship on fire. So it's likely that they went back to shore, maybe initially, but at least at some point, obviously, they went back to shore and then offered these sacrifices. Also, they made some sacrifice, some vows that indicate some future involvement. It's possible that this encounter led to some ongoing worship by these men of the true God. And Jonah couldn't even escape God's will through death. He's like, I don't want to obey God. I don't want to impact you guys poorly anymore. So let me just go to the point of death. But God is not okay with that. God intends to use Jonah, however unwilling he is. And he appoints this great fish. We don't know exactly what kind of species of fish it is, but God appoints this fish to be the ultimate phase in his plan to get to Jonah's heart. And Jonah is now in the ultimate low, the ultimate depths. He's circumstantially as low as it can get for Jonah. So what does all of this mean? What does this tell us? What lessons can we draw from it? First, I want to just point out something going on with the text. This is what we call a chiastic structure, where the first and the last have some similarities, some interesting contrast, and then the second and second to last, the third to last, and so on and so forth, leading up to the climax of the story upon which the story hinges. So just to give you a couple of these points, the sailors were initially afraid. At the end, the sailors fear the Lord. The sailors prayed to their gods. In the end, the sailors pray to the Lord, the God of heaven. All of this hinges around the climax of the story in verse 9, which is Jonah's confession, Jonah's defense, which, however critical, pointed to the sovereignty of God. Some key takeaways from this section. God is sovereign, and he works through circumstances for his plan simultaneously in the lives of everyone affected. He worked in Jonah's life and in the lives of the mariners. There are so many moving parts in this world, so many lives, so many decisions that each of us make, each with so many impacts that we can't see, so many interactions we have with others. We're not even close to having enough vantage point to understand the complexity of this world and the management of it. Not even close to having a vantage point to challenge God on how he's working out his plan, on his program in this world. In this story, he effectively shows himself to the mariners, and by the end of it, they're fearing him. But he also pursues Jonah. He does this at the same time through the use of this storm and the ordaining in the circumstances in the storm. I want to note that God overcame the sin of his servant Jonah in this story to bring tremendous good out of the situation for the mariners. God can overcome our weaknesses for the good of others. The rebellion of God's children grieves him, but he wants restoration, not punishment. He will go about it graciously and according to his character. Often we sin and feel like God doesn't want us anymore, that we've blown it too much and it's not worth it. Often we can have this meritorious understanding of who God it is as well, but God doesn't work that way. Yes, we cannot have fellowship with God as we dwell in sin, but our Heavenly Father has gone to the greatest lengths possible to provide and promote relationship with us. He is a God of grace, blessing us, pursuing us, though we don't deserve it at all. Think of his heart for the one sheep out of 100 that had gone astray. He would leave the 99 to run, to chase after the one sheep. That is his heart for you and for me. We make him very sad when we sin, but he doesn't want to push us away. He gets no enjoyment from punishing, from isolating his children. He chases after us, and he wants us to turn back to him. We see also, and perhaps most clearly in this story, that sin, that rebellion has consequences, and God will eventually and fully deal with it, again, according to his character. Though he would much prefer our restoration, God must deal with sin and rebellion. As his children, he chastens us, he disciplines us for our good. And we often forget that as we're seeking sin and rebellion, because we're throwing a temper tantrum, wanting our way above his. The discipline of the Lord, the chastening of the Lord, is for our ultimate good. And all of this in the life of Jonah is for Jonah's good. And we already mentioned that it was good for the mariners. God worked good for the mariners out of it. But there will be consequences for our sin, especially as we continue to remain in a spirit of rebellion, though we know God's trying to get our attention. And there were a number of consequences for Jonah's sin. He chose this, but he so wanted his own way that he left his world behind. The storm was his fault. It put the lives of the mariners in danger. His consequences extended beyond him, and we would be foolish to think that our sin, our mistakes, only ever affect us. He lost his spiritual focus, his energy. Jonah became complacent. He became apathetic. He didn't care. He lost true peace from his relationship with God and had to settle for false substitutes. He lost his power in prayer. His prayers were not effective. He lost his purpose and fulfillment. Ultimately, he lost his desire to live. Throw me in the sea, because he had abandoned God's will. Lastly, his testimony was damaged. In verse 9, the testimony he gives is damaged because of his hypocrisy. Are you seeing any of these consequences in your lives? Am I seeing any in mine? These consequences are real, and we might still see each and every one of these things in our lives today. Sin destroys. Any of these things can happen to us, and God does use circumstances to get our attention, and we need to respond to that. And the sad irony of the story is that none of this had to happen if Jonah had obeyed God, or even if he had turned back to him sooner. At the end of this section, at verse 17, we see Jonah at absolute rock bottom. And unfortunately, this is sometimes what it takes for us to turn our eyes back on God. But God is always there, waiting for us to look to him. He loves us. He is full of grace and willingness to accept us upon our turning to him. He accepted the mariners, and he accepts us when we turn back to him. It's never too late. In the next session, we're going to see if the fish will be enough to get Jonah's attention, because Jonah didn't intend to go for a ride in the fish. He wanted to be thrown overboard. He thought his life would be ending. But there he is in the belly of a fish. And I want to challenge you, don't let it take a fish. Obviously, I'm speaking metaphorically. Don't let it take a fish for God to get your attention. Turn back to God. Keep short accounts with Him. Walk by the Spirit. God will use progressive measures in your life if necessary. But He doesn't want to take us down. God doesn't take pleasure in punishing us. He wants to build us up. Let's give Him an opportunity to. Let's not even put ourselves in that situation like Jonah did. Let's seek God and obey Him and His word in the first place. But undoubtedly, we all make mistakes. We all sin. We all fail. We all find ourselves out of fellowship with God. And this story is a challenge that there will be consequences, but that God is still seeking after us, and that He can still bring good both in our lives and in the lives of others that we've impacted with our sin. It's never too late to seek Him. Wherever you are today in your relationship with God, I challenge you to turn back to God, to seek Him, and to live in fellowship with Him. It's always the smoothest ride. Thank you, guys. Next week, we'll be looking at Jonah in the belly of the whale. What's his response to this? Does God get his attention? Until then, take care.